What if you could take a shortcut to understanding, well, some of the biggest mysteries of life, all curated just for you? Today, we're diving headfirst into one of the most profound and perplexing questions humanity has ever grappled with: consciousness.
Yeah, this deep dive is all about trying to pull back the curtain on what consciousness actually is. You know, how we've tried to define it across centuries and, gosh, countless fields.
And the cutting edge science and philosophy that are attempting to finally unlock its secrets.
Exactly. We'll explore everything from, like, ancient thought right up to modern brain research, and even the pretty startling implications for artificial intelligence.
And for this deep dive, we've gathered a stack of truly fascinating sources. We're drawing insights from the incredibly thorough Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, too.
And diving into the latest breakthroughs from places like the Allen Institute for Brain Science and, sifting through key findings on Wikipedia as well.
So our mission, really, is to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, the key insights from all this rich material.
Yeah, aiming to give you a clear, engaging, and hopefully well-informed perspective on the very nature of awareness itself.
Okay, so let's unpack this. When we talk about consciousness, it might seem like a really modern scientific pursuit, maybe.
You'd think so, but the questions about it, gosh, they stretch back further than recorded history. You can see hints of it in, like, ancient Neolithic burial practices.
Really?
Yeah, and the animistic beliefs of early preliterate cultures. There's a sense of awareness being important even back then.
That's a great starting point, because the very word consciousness itself carries that history, doesn't it?
It does. It comes from the Latin conscientia, meaning knowledge with. Originally, it was more about shared moral knowledge, like what a witness knows.
Okay.
But its meaning really began to shift, transform in the early modern era.
And that's where figures like René Descartes come in,
Right.
right, back in the 17th century.
Absolutely. He was foundational. He defined thought, or pensée as he called it, as all that of which we are conscious as operating in us.
So for him, consciousness was just essential to thought, almost inseparable.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
He didn't really entertain the idea of, unconscious mental states much at all. If it wasn't conscious, it wasn't really thought in his view.
Right. And then John Locke, a bit later in the 17th century.
Yeah, Locke really solidified that modern concept even further. He defined consciousness as the perception of what passes in a man's own mind.
And that idea just took hold.
Oh, definitely. It
Yeah.
truly permeated 18th century British philosophy. Hugely influential.
So Descartes and Locke, they seem to be charting this path where consciousness was totally central to our mental life. But, was there any pushback early on? Any hints of, like, deeper hidden layers?
Oh, absolutely. G.W. Leibniz, around the same time, he challenged that idea. He had this fascinating concept of petite perceptions.
Petite's perception.
Yeah, essentially unconscious thoughts, things that still influence us even if we're not aware of them.
Ah.
And he also made a really crucial distinction between perception, which is just awareness, and apperception, that's self-awareness, being aware that you are aware.
Okay, that's subtle.
And he had this famous mill analogy. He said, look, if you blew up a brain to the size of a mill and walked around inside,
Yeah.
you'd see all the parts working, the gears turning, but you wouldn't see a conscious thought. You wouldn't observe the feeling itself.
Wow. So he was already highlighting that kind of explanatory gap, wasn't he? Centuries ago.
Exactly. A very early nod to the idea that consciousness might be something more than just the sum of its physical parts.
Interesting. But for much of the 18th and 19th centuries, though, the main view was still that thought and consciousness were largely interchangeable.
Yeah, largely. You had what was called associationist psychology, trying to map their interactions, basically, how ideas link together in our conscious minds.
But then Immanuel Kant, late 18th century, he kind of complicated things again.
He did. Kant argued that, look, conscious experience isn't just simple associations. It requires a much richer, more organized mental structure. And he, too, acknowledged the necessity of unconscious mental states. He saw we needed more machinery under the hood.
Okay, so then we get to early scientific psychology, mid-19th century. People like Wilhelm Wundt, William James.
Right, and the mind was still largely equated with consciousness then. So their methods were dominated by introspection people, basically just reporting on their own inner experiences.
Just describing what's going on inside.
Pretty much. But even as science was emerging, the mystery just persisted. T.H. Huxley, he famously noted this puzzling, explanatory gap.
Right, the gap between like poking brain tissue and actually having a feeling.
Exactly, between brain irritation and the state of consciousness. He called it as unaccountable as the appearance of the jinn, like magic. How does squishy brain stuff turn into subjective feeling?
Which is, I mean, let's be honest, a question we're still asking today.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then the 20th century took a bit of a weird detour, didn't it? Behaviorism.
Oh, yeah. Watson, Skinner.
Yeah.
They actively pushed consciousness out of mainstream scientific psychology, especially in the U.S.
Their argument was basically, if we can't observe it or measure it directly, it's not science.
That was the gist. So for decades, studying consciousness scientifically was almost taboo. Seriously.
Wow.
But thankfully, it made a huge comeback, a major resurgence, starting around the 1980s, maybe into the 90s.
Well, it happened.
Well, you started seeing new dedicated journals, like the Journal of Consciousness Studies. Professional societies popped up, like the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, the ASSC. Annual conferences started buzzing with new research.
So the scientific world finally decided it couldn't ignore the elephant in the room anymore.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
It was time to face the mystery head on again.
Okay, so fast forward to today, the term consciousness itself. It's still notoriously slippery, isn't it?
Oh, incredibly ambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
But we have developed some helpful distinctions to try and, get a better handle on it.
Right.
Well, there's creature consciousness. That's simply an organism being awake and aware, as opposed to, say, sleeping or being in a coma.
So just being on, like a human being is conscious in this sense.
Exactly. Then we have state consciousness. This refers more to individual conscious mental states, like feeling a specific pain, or having a particular perception, or thinking a thought.
And that's what most modern theories focus on. What makes that particular state a conscious one?
Precisely. We also distinguish between being conscious of something that's called transitive consciousness versus just being conscious in a general intransitive sense.
Okay, got it.
But maybe the most fundamental, the most commonly used concept today comes from the philosopher Thomas Nagel, his 1974 essay, What It Is Like.
Ah, yes, the famous bat essay.
That's the one. His core idea is that a being is conscious if there's something that it is like to be that creature from its own subjective first-person point of view.
Like what it feels like for a bat to experience the world using echolocation.
Exactly. You and I, we can understand the physics of echolocation, maybe even build the device that does it. But we can never truly know what that subjective experience is like for the bat.
But we know there is an experience there.
Right. And these subjective experiences, these what it's like states, are also called phenomenal states, or sometimes qualitative states.
Mm-hmm.
They're also associated with this term qualia.
Qualia, those are the raw feels.
Yeah, the unique felt properties of conscious states, like the redness of red, the specific taste of coffee, the sharpness of a pain, the qualities themselves.
Okay. So we've traced how the concept evolved from ancient inklings to these modern distinctions. But beneath all these definitions, there's this really fundamental, almost agonizing question.
The big one.
How exactly do our inner subjective mental worlds relate to our physical brains?
Yep. And that, of course, is the absolute heart of what's known as the mind-body problem.
And this mind-body problem, it really splits people into two main camps, roughly speaking.
Broadly, yes. On one side, you have dualism.
Dualism. The idea that the mind, or conscious states, are somehow non-physical, literally outside the realm of physics.
That's the core idea. And it often resonates with this very strong intuition we have, right? From your own first-person perspective, conscious experiences just don't seem like physical things, like neurons firing.
It feels different.
And within dualism, you get different flavors. There's substance dualism, which is most famously associated with Descartes.
Okay.
He proposed two fundamentally distinct kinds of substances in the universe.
Yeah.
Physical stuff, which he called res extensa, extended stuff.
Like tables and chairs and brains.
Right. And then non-physical thinking stuff, res cogitans, the realm of thought, consciousness, mind.
And he even had an idea about where they connected.
He did. He rather famously speculated that they interact in a tiny structure in the brain, the pineal gland, a sort of bridge between the two worlds.
Interesting. But maybe not widely accepted now.
No, the specific pineal gland idea hasn't held up. But then there's also property dualism, which is a bit more nuanced, maybe more common today among dualists.
How does that work?
Property dualism holds that, okay, physical laws are universally valid. The brain is a physical system. But conscious properties, like the feeling of pain or the experience of red, are neither identical with nor reducible to physical properties. even if they arise from physical things.
So consciousness is a property of the physical brain, but not a physical property itself.
Kind of. Some versions, like fundamental property dualism, suggest conscious properties are actually basic, fundamental constituents of reality, like spin or charge might be in physics.
Wow.
Others, like emergent property dualism, propose that consciousness arises from complex physical organization, like in a brain, but it's somehow over and above its physical causes. It's a genuinely new property that emerges.
Like wetness emerging from H2O molecules, maybe? Wetness isn't a property of a single molecule, but it emerges from the collective.
That's a common analogy, yeah, though philosophers debate if it's a perfect one. But the idea is that consciousness emerges but can't be fully explained just by looking at the parts.
So, what are the big arguments for dualism? Why do people find it compelling?
Well, there are some powerful thought experiments. One type is the conceivability argument. The idea is if you can logically conceive of something, it must be at least possible.
Okay.
So, can you conceive of a perfect physical duplicate of a human being, molecule for molecule identical, but that lacks consciousness? A philosophical zombie.
A zombie that acts human but has no inner light on.
Exactly, no subjective experience. If you can conceive of that, dualists argue, then consciousness can't be purely physical. It must be something extra, something that the physical facts alone don't guarantee.
That's a tricky one.
It is. And another hugely influential argument is Frank Jackson's knowledge argument, usually illustrated with the story of Mary's room.
Right. Mary, the neuroscientist in the black and white room.
Precisely. Imagine Mary knows every single physical fact there is to know about color vision. She knows all the physics, the neuroscience, the wavelengths, how cones work, everything. But she's lived her entire life in a completely black and white environment.
Okay, poor Mary.
So the question is, when she finally leaves the room and sees a ripe red tomato for the very first time, does she learn anything new?
Well, intuitively, yeah. She learns what it's like to see red.
Exactly. The dualist argument is she knew all the physical facts before, but she didn't know this. She learns a new fact about the experience of red, the quail. Therefore, that fact must be non-physical. Consciousness involves non-physical facts.
That's a compelling story.
It really is. And historically, you also see dualism deeply connected with certain theological and metaphysical beliefs.
Like immortality.
Yeah, think about it. If your mind, your consciousness, is non-physical, then the idea that it could survive the death of your physical body seems much more plausible, right?
Sure, it's not tied to the body in the same way.
And it also offers a potential explanation for free will. If our conscious decisions are non-physical events, maybe they can genuinely intervene in the physical world and alter what would otherwise be deterministic physical processes.
So it allows for genuine choice, not just brain chemistry playing out.
That's the appeal. It feels very intuitive, maybe even comforting for many people.
However, dualism faces some pretty significant objections, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Big ones. The most famous, the classic one, is the interaction problem.
How does the non-physical mind actually do anything to the physical brain and vice versa?
Exactly. If they're fundamentally different kinds of stuff or were different kinds of properties, how can they causally interact? How can a non-physical decision make your physical arm move?
That's where Gilbert Ryle famously critiqued Descartes' view, calling it the ghost in the machine.
Yep. How does the ghost pull the levers of the machine? There's also the problem of conservation of energy.
Right. If a non-physical mind causes physical effects in the brain, where does the energy for that effect come from? It seems like it would have to violate fundamental laws of physics, like the conservation of energy.
Or if the body causes mental effects, where does the energy go? It's a real puzzle for interactionist dualism.
And maybe the biggest challenge today comes from neuroscience itself.
I'd say so. The sheer weight of evidence showing incredibly tight correlations between specific brain damage and specific mental deficits is hard for dualism to explain.
Like, damage this part of the brain, lose this specific ability or type of awareness.
Exactly. Why would a supposedly non-physical mind be so intimately and systematically dependent on the physical state of the brain down to very fine details if it's truly separate?
It seems like if the mind was separate, it shouldn't be so easily disrupted by physical damage.
That's the line of reasoning. All these challenges really push many thinkers towards the other main camp in the mind-body debate.
Which brings us squarely to physicalism, or materialism as it's sometimes called.
Right. And this is It's fair to say the dominant view among contemporary philosophers of mind and certainly among neuroscientists.
And the general idea here is pretty straightforward, isn't it?
It is. Conscious mental activity is identical with or entirely caused by neural activity in the brain, full stop. There's no extra non-physical stuff, no ghost.
Just the machine, the brain, doing its thing.
Essentially, yes. And this view is strongly supported by that explosion of scientific knowledge about the brain we mentioned.
We see it everywhere, right? From brain death being the medical and legal criterion for the end of life.
Exactly. To how stimulating specific brain areas reliably results in specific conscious experiences, like triggering a memory or a visual flash.
For many neurophysiologists, it's not just a theory anymore, it's almost a fundamental working assumption for doing their research.
That's often the case, yes. They assume mental events are brain events and try to figure out the details.
Now, physicalism, like dualism, also comes in different varieties.
It does. One important distinction is token identity theory.
Okay, what's that?
It says that each individual conscious mental event, like this specific thought I'm having right now, this particular instance or token, is identical to some particular physical brain process happening in my brain right now.
So my current feeling of understanding is literally just some specific pattern of neurons firing in my head.
That's the idea. Now, the interesting thing about token identity is it allows for what's called multiple realizability.
Multiple realizability, meaning the same type of mental state could be realized in different physical systems.
Precisely. So maybe the feeling of pain could be realized by a certain neural process in a human brain, but also by a completely different kind of process in, say, an octopus's brain, or maybe even a future AI's silicon brain.
So the type of feeling, pain, isn't tied to one specific type of physical state.
Right, and that's why type identity theory is less popular. That's the stronger claim that specific types of mental states like being in pain in general are identical to specific types of brain states like C fiber firing in general.
And the problem there is, well, why should only human C fibers count as pain? What about aliens or octopuses?
Exactly. Multiple realizability seems very plausible, which makes type identity problematic for many.
Okay. Then there are more radical views within physicalism.
Yes, you have eliminativism, or eliminative materialism. This is the idea that our common sense concepts about the mind, like belief, desire, maybe even consciousness or qualia, are actually deeply flawed.
Like they're bad theories.
Kind of. The idea is that these concepts are so muddled and inaccurate that they won't be smoothly reduced to neuroscience. Instead, they'll eventually be eliminated entirely from our scientific vocabulary and replaced by more precise neurophysiological terms.
Like how the concept of phlogiston was eliminated from chemistry when we understood combustion better?
That's the classic analogy, yes. Eliminativists think our folk psychology is similarly destined for the historical dustbin.
That's a bold claim.
It is. And then there's non-reductive physicalism, which tries to find a middle ground.
How so?
It holds that physicalism is true ontologically, yes. Consciousness is ultimately physical. There's only physical stuff. But mental facts or descriptions cannot be strictly deduced from or reduced to physical facts or descriptions alone.
So even if we knew every physical detail of the brain, we couldn't automatically derive the full story of the conscious experience just from that physical description.
That's the idea. It often relies on the concept of supervenience.
Supervenience.
It basically means that the mental depends on the physical in a specific way. Any difference in mental states must correspond to some difference in physical states. You can't change the mind without changing the brain.
Okay. So the mental supervenes on the physical. It's determined by it, but maybe not fully explainable in terms of it.
That's a good way to put it. The mental properties are still seen as physical, but perhaps they're higher-level organizational properties that aren't easily captured by lower-level physics descriptions.
But physicalism, even with all its scientific backing, it definitely faces its own challenges, right? That feeling that something's still missing.
Oh, absolutely. Big time.
Yeah.
Remember Joseph Levine's explanatory gap from 1983?
Yeah, the idea that even if consciousness is physical, we still can't really explain why or how a specific brain process produces a specific feeling.
Exactly. There seems to be this odd kind of arbitrariness, as Levine put it. Why does this particular pattern of neural firing feel like the taste of chocolate and not like the smell of roses or like nothing at all? We lack that explanatory bridge.
And this sounds very close to David Chalmers' famous Hard Problem of Consciousness from 1995.
It's very related, yes. Chalmers made a crucial distinction. He said there are easy problems of consciousness, things like how the brain integrates information, focuses attention, discriminates stimuli, accesses internal states. These are complex, but they're ultimately about explaining the functions of consciousness. We can see a path to solving them using standard neuroscience methods.
Okay, explaining what the brain does.
Right. But then there's the hard problem. Why does performing these functions feel like anything at all from the inside? Why is there subjective, phenomenal experience that what it is like aspect?
How does the objective functioning give rise to this subjective feeling?
That's the nut of it. Explaining the quality of experience, not just the function. That, Chalmers argues, is the truly hard problem. And it's not clear that standard scientific methods alone can crack it.
And then there's the even more pessimistic view, Mysterianism.
Yeah, championed by Colin McGinn. He basically argues that the hard problem might be inherently insoluble for human minds.
Like we're just not smart enough, or our brains aren't wired the right way.
Kind of. He calls it cognitive closure. Just like a dog might be cognitively closed to understanding quantum mechanics, its brain simply isn't capable of grasping those concepts. Perhaps our brains are fundamentally incapable of grasping the link between physical brain processes and subjective consciousness.
Wow, that's a bit depressing for researchers.
It is a humbling thought. But of course, physicalists have strong replies to these challenges.
What do they say?
Well, many argue that the explanatory gap and the hard problem aren't necessarily signs of a fundamental ontological barrier between mind and brain. They might just reflect the temporary limitations of our current scientific understanding.
So we just don't know yet, but we might figure it out.
Exactly. Think about Mary in the black and white room again. The physicalist reply is often that she doesn't learn a new, non-physical fact when she sees red.
What does she learn then?
She gains a new way of knowing, or a new ability. She learns how to recognize red, or she gains a new perspective on, or mode of presentation of, the same underlying physical fact she already knew theoretically. Experiencing red isn't learning a new proposition, it's acquiring a new skill or perspective.
So it's about know how, not know that?
That's one popular line of argument, yes. And they push back against Mysterianism, too,
Oh.
by pointing out that, look, humans clearly do have some grasp of consciousness and brain function.
Right.
We study it, we talk about it, we make progress. It's not like rats trying to understand calculus where there's just zero comprehension.
We're not completely closed off to it.
Right. Science is still remarkably young in this area. Think about how little we knew about, say, chemistry or genetics a few centuries ago. We've made incredible strides, and the physicalist bet is that our understanding of the brain-consciousness link will continue to evolve, and maybe that gap will eventually close.
Okay, that makes sense. Building on that optimism, a major focus in neuroscience today is the hunt for the NCCs, right? The neural correlates of consciousness.
Exactly. This is a huge area of research, trying to map consciousness directly in the brain. The goal is to find those specific patterns of brain activity that are ideally both necessary and sufficient for a particular conscious experience. When this happens in the brain, you have the experience. When it doesn't, you don't.
What are some of the leading candidates for these NCCs?
Well, one very influential idea proposed by Francis Crick and Christoph Koch back in 1990 involves gamma band oscillations.
High-frequency brainwaves.
Yeah, the idea is that conscious states might occur when large groups of neurons fire together synchronously, in rhythm, at a high frequency, typically around 35 to 75 hertz.
And why would that be important?
One thought is that this synchronized firing could be the brain's way of solving the binding problem.
Ah, the binding problem. How do we get a unified experience from all the separate bits of information?
Precisely. How does the brain take the shape, color, motion, and sound of, say, a bouncing red ball, which are processed in different brain areas, and bind them together into one seamless, unified conscious perception of that ball? Synchronized gamma oscillations across those different areas could be the mechanism that links them.
Okay, that's a neat idea. Are there other contenders for NCCs?
Oh yes, several. For instance, Gerald Edelman emphasized reentrant cortical feedback loops. The idea is that consciousness arises from complex, recursive signaling back and forth between different brain maps.
Constant communication loops.
Right. Hans Flohr pointed to NMDA-mediated transient neural assemblies, focusing on the specific neurochemistry and how temporary groups of neurons might fire together. And Antonio Damasio has highlighted the role of emotive somatosensory homeostatic processes, particularly in the frontal lobe, linking consciousness very closely to our feelings, our body's internal state, and our sense of self.
So different theories focus on different aspects: synchrony, feedback loops, specific neuron groups, emotional centers.
Exactly. It's likely a combination of factors.
Mm.
And some really interesting insights are emerging from this research.
It's as.
Well, one thing that's become clear is that activity in the very first sensory processing areas, like the primary visual cortex, V1, for vision alone, often isn't enough for conscious awareness.
So you can have activity in V1 without actually seeing something consciously?
It seems so, yes. People can show V1 activity in response to a stimulus, but not report being aware of it. This suggests consciousness likely involves later, higher stages of processing.
So where are researchers looking more closely?
Higher brain areas seem more promising, especially parts of the prefrontal cortex, which is heavily involved in executive functions like planning, decision-making, and working memory, and also parts of the temporal lobe.
And isn't there something about the direction of information flow?
Yes, this is fascinating. It seems that top-down neural activity signals propagating from higher areas like the frontal cortex back down to sensory areas might be more predictive of conscious awareness than the initial bottom-up flow of sensory information from the senses up to the cortex.
So it's like our attention or expectations, controlled by higher areas, are crucial for bringing things into consciousness.
That seems to be part of the story, yes. It's not just about raw input, it's about how the brain interprets and selects that input.
And are we getting any closer to finding correlates for specific qualia, like the redness of red?
That's the ultimate goal, and there are hints. Some recent research shows that how intensely neurons fire and how synchronized they are in primary visual areas actually correlates with how bright or contrasty a person subjectively perceives a stimulus to be.
So changes in neural activity match changes in the reported feeling.
Exactly. It's not explaining why it feels like brightness, but it's finding a direct neural correlate for that specific qualitative intensity. It's a step.
What about measuring consciousness overall? Is there a way to get like a number for how conscious someone is?
There's a really exciting development there called the Perturbational Complexity Index, or PCI, developed around 2013.
How does that work?
Basically, they give the brain a little nudge with a magnetic pulse, transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, and then they measure the complexity of the electrical echoes, the resulting brain activity using EEG.
Okay.
The idea is that a more conscious brain will respond with a more complex, widespread, and unpredictable pattern of activity, reflecting more integrated information processing. A less conscious brain, like in deep sleep or anesthesia, will have a much simpler and more localized, stereotypical response.
So you get a score based on the complexity of the response.
Pretty much, yeah. Higher PCI values are found in people who are awake, in REM sleep, even in patients with locked-in syndrome, compared to much lower values in deep sleep or vegetative states. It's offering a potential objective, quantitative measure of the level of consciousness.
That could be huge for clinical situations, right? Assessing patients with brain injuries.
Absolutely. It's still experimental, but very promising. And other research is pinpointing specific brain networks, too. A 2016 study identified a tiny region deep in the brainstem.
The brainstem, I thought consciousness was all about the cortex.
Well, the brainstem is crucial for arousal, for just being awake. This study suggested a specific part, the rostral dorsolateral pontine tegmentum, acts like a key driver, maintaining consciousness through its functional connections with specific cortical areas, particularly in the insula and cingulate cortex.
Like an ignition system connected to the main engine.
Kind of like that, yeah. Maybe a triad of regions working together. But even with these discoveries, there's still big debates about specific structures.
Like the claustrum, I remember hearing about that.
Ah, yes, the claustrum debate. Cricket and Koch, again, famously proposed in 2004 that this thin, mysterious sheet of neurons deep in the brain might be like the conductor of the orchestra, integrating information from all over the cortex to create unified consciousness.
Okay, the conductor.
And a 2014 study seemed to support this because stimulating the claustrum in a patient actually induced temporary unconsciousness.
Wow.
But then a more recent study in 2022 challenged this view. It suggested the claustrum is perhaps more like a sophisticated router or switchboard, crucial for coordinating complex tasks, but maybe not the ultimate seat or source of consciousness itself.
So the jury's still out on the claustrum's exact role.
Very much so. The story of mapping consciousness in the brain is definitely still being written chapter by chapter.
And all these scientific findings, they really fuel different theories and models that try to bridge the gap between the brain science and the philosophical questions, right?
Exactly. They inspire specific ways of thinking about how the brain might actually generate consciousness. One major area here is what are called representational theories.
Representational theories, based on the idea that the mind represents the world.
Precisely. The core idea is that consciousness can be explained in terms of mental representations or intentional states. Those mental states we have that are about something or directed at something in the world, like a thought about Paris or a perception of a tree.
And the hope is that explaining representation is easier than explaining raw feeling.
That's the strategic bet, yeah. If we can understand how the brain represents the world, maybe we can leverage that to understand consciousness itself, making it a more naturalistic, scientifically tractable problem.
Okay, so how do these theories work?
Well, one type is first-order representationalism, or FOR. This tries to explain conscious experience primarily through our world-directed intentional states, our perceptions and thoughts about the external world.
So the consciousness is in the representing, not in something extra.
Kind of. A key piece of evidence cited for OR is the idea of the transparency of experience.
Transparency.
Yeah, the idea is that when you try to introspect on your own conscious experience, say, your experience of seeing a blue sky, you don't really see the experience itself. You seem to see right through the experience to the thing it represents, the blueness of the sky. The experience itself feels transparent.
Okay. I think I get that. You focus on the sky, not on your experience of the sky.
Right. So 4R says the conscious quality is just a feature of the representational content itself. But then you have higher order, or HO, representationalism.
Taking it up a level?
Exactly. HO theories argue that a mental state, like seeing the blue sky, only becomes conscious when there is another, higher order mental state, like a thought or a perception, which is about that first mental state.
So you need to be like aware of seeing the blue sky for the seeing to be conscious.
That's the basic idea. The first state represents the world, the second state represents the first state, and that second state is what makes the first state conscious. It's like having a meta-awareness.
Okay, that adds another layer.
It does. And then a newer, pretty interesting approach tries to blend these, or offer an alternative, hybrid or self-representational accounts.
Self-representational.
Yeah. These theories argue that the metapsychological awareness, the awareness of the mental state, isn't actually a separate, distinct, higher-order state. Instead, it's somehow intrinsic to the conscious state itself.
So the conscious state somehow represents itself as well as representing the world.
In a sense, yes. The state is inherently self-directed, making it conscious without needing a separate higher-order thought pointing at it. It's a subtle but important difference, trying to capture the immediacy of conscious awareness.
Fascinating. Okay, so those are representational theories. What about other approaches, maybe more focused on the brain's overall structure or function?
Right, then we get into what you might call cognitive architectures. These are models of how the mind-brain is organized and how consciousness fits into that organization.
Like blueprints for the mind.
Sort of.
Yeah.
One very famous one is the Global Workspace Theory, or GWT, proposed by Bernard Bars back in 1988.
The blackboard idea.
That's the metaphor, yeah. GWT visualizes the mind like a theater or a blackboard. You have lots of unconscious, specialized processes working in the background, kind of like actors waiting in the wings or specialists working on different parts of the blackboard.
Okay.
These unconscious processes compete for access to a central, limited capacity global workspace, the spotlight on stage or the main area of the blackboard.
And the winner gets.
The winning information, the stuff that gets into the spotlight, is then broadcast globally throughout the entire system, making it available to all the other unconscious specialists. And that global availability, Bars argues, is what makes the information conscious.
So consciousness is like fame in the brain, information becoming widely accessible.
That's a good way to put it. In this view, consciousness is seen as a functional adaptation, a very useful way for a complex system to integrate information and coordinate its actions.
And people like Stanislas Dehaene have built on this with neuroscience.
Yes, Dehaene and others have developed the global neuronal workspace model. They suggest that conscious access involves a sudden nonlinear ignition, a large-scale cascade of neural activity that floods a widespread network involving prefrontal cortex and other areas, making the information globally available very quickly.
Okay, that connects the theory to brain activity. What else?
Another interesting cognitive model is the attention schema theory, developed by Michael Graziano starting around 2011.
Attention schema.
Graziano proposes that what we call awareness or consciousness isn't some mysterious extra property. Instead, it's the brain's own internal model or schema of its state of attention.
So the brain builds a model of where its attention is focused.
Exactly. Just like the brain builds models of physical objects or its own body, Graziano argues it also builds a simplified, useful model of its own complex attentional processes. This attention schema allows the brain to monitor and predict its own attentional shifts.
And that model is what we experience as awareness.
That's the claim. And crucially, the brain also uses this schema to understand and predict the attentional states of others, attributing awareness to them based on observing their behavior. It's a model of attention that gets interpreted as subjective awareness.
Huh. So awareness is like the brain's user interface for its own attention system.
That's a pretty good analogy, yeah.
Okay, one more major theory I know we need to touch on. Integrated information theory, IIT.
Ah, yes, IIT. Developed by Giulio Tononi, starting around 2004. This is a very different and quite bold approach.
How so?
IIT starts from the phenomenology, from the essential properties of conscious experience itself, like the fact that it's unified, specific, differentiated, and tries to work backwards to figure out what kind of physical system could produce that.
Okay, starting from the experience.
Right. And Tononi postulates that consciousness is fundamentally integrated information. He argues that the capacity of a system to integrate information is both necessary and sufficient for consciousness.
Integrated information, meaning information that's interconnected and makes a difference to the system as a whole.
Yeah, roughly. It's about how much information is generated by the system above and beyond the information generated by its parts independently. It proposes a precise mathematical measure for this, called phi, represented by the Greek letter.
Phi, a measure of consciousness.
A measure of the capacity for consciousness, according to IIT. The higher the phi value of a system, the more conscious it is, or could be.
And this applies to any system, not just brains.
That's the really radical part. IIT asserts that consciousness depends only on the system's causal structure and its ability to integrate information, regardless of the substrate. It doesn't have to be biological. Silicon potentially could be conscious if organized correctly.
Wow.
And what's truly mind-bending and controversial about IIT is that it implies a form of panpsychism, or at least micropsychism.
Panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is everywhere, in everything.
Pretty much. Because even very simple systems have some non-zero value of phi, IIT suggests that consciousness isn't something that suddenly emerges only in complex brains. Instead, it might be a fundamental property of reality, present in varying degrees, even in simple things, maybe even down to fundamental particles, though perhaps negligibly small in most cases.
So even a thermostat or a photodiode might have a tiny glimmer of consciousness according to IIT.
In principle, yes, though the phi value would be incredibly low compared to a human brain. It completely upends our usual human-centric view, suggesting consciousness might be graded and much more widespread than we typically assume.
That really does push the boundaries of imagination, which leads naturally to thinking about consciousness beyond humans. What about animals?
Yeah, the question of animal consciousness is a huge topic, and
Yeah.
thankfully we've moved beyond the old Cartesian view that animals are just mindless automata.
That view is largely rejected today, right?
Oh, definitely. The evidence for animal consciousness is pretty compelling now. It comes from multiple lines. Well, behavioral similarities, obviously. Animals engage in complex behaviors that look very much like they're driven by conscious thought and feeling. Then there are the physiological parallels. Mammals, birds, their brain structures, homologous to ours, similar neurochemistry, shared DNA.
The underlying machinery looks similar.
Right. And there are studies, like those highlighted by Donald Griffin in his book Animal Minds, suggesting animals can hold beliefs or mental representations about things they don't directly perceive at that moment, thinking about things that aren't right in front of them.
And wasn't there a big declaration about this from scientists?
Yes, a really landmark moment was the Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness in 2012. A group of prominent neuroscientists got together and signed a statement.
What did it say?
It asserted, quite clearly, that based on the evidence, non-human animals, including all mammals and birds and other creatures, have the necessary neural substrates of consciousness and the capacity to exhibit intentional behaviors.
So a strong scientific consensus that the physical basis for consciousness exists in many animals, and they show signs of it.
Exactly. It's a powerful statement, shifting the burden of proof, really.
Now, does that mean animal consciousness is identical to human consciousness?
Probably not. While most scientists accept animal consciousness exists, it's generally acknowledged they may not have the same level or type of sophisticated conscious states as humans. They probably aren't pondering philosophy or writing symphonies.
Right.
Gerald Edelman made a useful distinction here. He talked about primary consciousness. the basic awareness of the world, sensations, emotions, which he thought is shared by humans and many animals.
Okay.
But then he proposed higher order consciousness, the ability to be conscious of being conscious, to have a concept of self, past, and future, often linked to language capacity, which he suggested might be uniquely human, or at least much more developed in humans.
And Angel's "What is it like to be a bat?" still applies, right? We can know that they are likely conscious, but not what it's like subjectively.
Precisely. Even with all the scientific knowledge, we can't truly bridge that subjective gap to know the bat's phenomenal world from the inside.
And this whole question has huge ethical implications, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The concept of sentience, the capacity for subjective experience, particularly the capacity to feel pleasure and pain, is absolutely central to the animal rights and animal welfare movements. If animals are sentient, if they can suffer, then that grants them a certain moral standing.
Okay, so if consciousness exists in animals,
Yeah.
what about machines? Artificial consciousness.
Ah, the other frontier. The idea of conscious artifacts is actually an ancient theme in human storytelling.
Like Greek myths, Pygmalion, or the golem in Jewish folklore.
Exactly. It's a deep-seated fascination or perhaps anxiety in our culture. Can we create minds?
But early on, when actual calculating machines appeared, there was skepticism. Ada Lovelace.
Right. Looking at Charles Babbage's early mechanical computer, the analytical engine, back in 1842, she was brilliant. She recognized its power, but believed it could only do what it was explicitly ordered to do. It couldn't originate anything, she thought. It couldn't think or be creative in a human-like way.
It was a tool, not a mind.
That was her view. Then, fast forward a century, Alan Turing proposed his famous Turing test in 1950.
The imitation game.
Yeah. Can a machine imitate a human in conversation so well that it fools a human interrogator? Turing proposed this as an operational test for intelligence, and maybe by extension, consciousness. If it acts indistinguishably from a conscious being, maybe we should consider it conscious.
But that's still hotly debated, isn't it? Does passing the test prove consciousness?
Exactly. The big philosophical question remains. Could a machine pass the Turing test just through clever programming, without having any genuine understanding or subjective experience? Could a philosophical zombie pass the test?
And that leads right into John Searle's Chinese room argument from 1980.
A hugely influential counter-argument against what Searle called strong AI. The idea that a suitably programmed computer doesn't just simulate a mind, it literally has a mind.
How does the argument go again?
Searle imagined himself, a native English speaker who knows no Chinese, locked in a room. He has a big rule book written in English and baskets of Chinese symbols. People outside slide questions in Chinese under the door. Searle uses the rule book, the program, to look up the incoming symbols and find the corresponding symbols to send back out.
Following the rules perfectly.
Right. He gets so good at following the rules that his answers in Chinese are indistinguishable from those of a native Chinese speaker. The people outside think there's someone fluent in Chinese inside the room.
But Searle himself still doesn't understand a word of Chinese, right?
Exactly. He's just manipulating symbols according to syntactic rules without grasping any of the semantic meaning. He has syntax, but no semantics.
So his point is,
Computers are like him in the room. They just manipulate symbols based on their programming. They can process syntax incredibly well, but they don't understand what the symbols mean. Therefore, computation alone isn't sufficient for genuine understanding or consciousness.
he argued computers lack the causal powers of the biological brain.
Yes, that was his term. He thought genuine consciousness requires the specific biological causal powers that brains have, something purely computational systems lack. They simulate, they don't duplicate.
A very powerful critique. Are there other ideas for testing machine consciousness?
Well, Viktor Argonov in 2014 proposed a non-Turing test. His idea was to see if a machine could produce genuinely original philosophical judgments about consciousness itself without having been specifically programmed with philosophical arguments or human opinions on the topic.
Could it reason about its own potential nature?
That's the intriguing idea. Could it generate novel insights into the very problem we're discussing? And from a completely different angle, you have perspectives like the Buddhist concept of Siddhasatthana or mind stream.
How does that relate?
It describes consciousness not as a fixed thing, but as a continuously changing stream of mental phenomena influenced by various causes and conditions or laws. It emphasizes the dynamic, process-like nature of consciousness, which might offer a different lens for thinking about both biological and potentially artificial minds. Mindfulness, in this view, is key to understanding this stream directly.
Okay, so we've covered history, philosophy, neuroscience, animals, AI. What about when consciousness goes?
Different. Altered states?
Yeah, altered states and medical conditions offer incredibly valuable insights, almost like studying consciousness under stress or when parts are missing.
Like naturally altered states, sleep and dreaming.
Exactly. Sleep isn't just unconsciousness. We cycle through different stages with distinct patterns of brain activity, metabolism, even eye movements in REM sleep.
And dream sleep involves these rich, often bizarre narratives, right? Rich, continuous, but often illogical experiences. And interestingly, both deep sleep and REM sleep severely disrupt our normal ability to form new memories. Studying these states tells us a lot about the mechanisms supporting waking consciousness and memory encoding.
Then there are pathological alterations from illness or injury.
Yes, and these can be tragic, but they're scientifically crucial. Take partial epileptic seizures. Patients might experience impaired or even lost consciousness, yet they can sometimes still perform automated behaviors, like walking or fumbling with objects.
A dissociation between awareness and action.
Exactly. And then you have the spectrum of disorders of consciousness, or DUHI. This ranges from a minimally conscious state, where there's some intermittent, fluctuating awareness.
To a persistent vegetative state where patients have sleep-wake cycles, they might open their eyes but show no signs of awareness of themselves or the environment.
Right. And then further down to chronic coma and ultimately brain death, where there's irreversible cessation of all brain function. Mapping these different states helps us understand the neural requirements for different levels of consciousness.
And locked-in syndrome is particularly striking, isn't it?
It really is. Patients are fully conscious and aware, they have sleep-wake cycles, they can often think and feel normally, and usually communicate through purposeful eye movements, but they are almost completely paralyzed otherwise.
It's a terrifying illustration of how awareness can be completely disconnected from physical responsiveness.
Absolutely. It shows that outward behavior isn't always a reliable guide to inner consciousness.
And what about anosognosia? That's the one where people aren't aware of their own deficits.
Yes, a truly fascinating and baffling disorder. Patients might be paralyzed on one side of their body after a stroke or be cortically blind, yet they are completely unaware of their disability. They might vehemently deny being paralyzed even when confronted with clear evidence.
How is that even possible?
It forces us to really reevaluate our basic assumptions about self-awareness and how the brain constructs our sense of reality. It shows that our conscious awareness of ourselves isn't a simple reflection of reality, it's an active construction, and it can break down in specific ways.
Then, of course, there are drug-induced alterations.
A huge category. Various psychoactive drugs can profoundly alter consciousness.
Yeah.
Alcohol, stimulants, cannabis, they all have effects.
But psychedelics are maybe the most dramatic. LSD, psilocybin, DMT.
Often, yes. They can lead to a wide range of effects. Dulling of consciousness, or conversely, greatly increased sensory intensity and richness, vivid hallucinations, altered sense of self, distortions of time and space, and sometimes profound mystical type experiences or feelings of unity.
And we know these often work on specific neurotransmitter systems.
Yes, alterations in the serotonin system seem particularly important for the classic psychedelics. Studying how these drugs change brain activity and connectivity while altering subjective experience gives us clues about the neurochemistry underlying normal consciousness.
Didn't psychologist Charles Tart study the components of consciousness altered by drugs?
He did back in the 60s and 70s. He tried to identify different dimensions or components of consciousness. Things like extroception, awareness of the external world, introception, awareness of internal body states, memory access, sense of identity, evaluation decision-making, and then map how different drugs selectively altered these components. It was an early attempt at a kind of state-space map of consciousness.
So how do doctors typically assess consciousness in a clinical setting?
Medically, it's usually assessed primarily as a level of arousal and responsiveness.
Is there a standard procedure?
A simple bedside check involves looking for eye opening, verbal response, and motor response. Checking if the patient follows commands, reacts to stimuli like touch or sound, and if they're oriented, do they know their name, where they are, the date. That's the alert and oriented ×4 you might hear about.
Okay.
For a more detailed and standardized neurological assessment, especially after brain injury, doctors often use tools like the Glasgow Coma Scale or GCS.
That gives a score, right?
Yes, it scores eye-opening, verbal response, and motor response, giving a total score between 3, deep coma or death, and 15, fully awake and alert. A score of 8 or less typically indicates coma, It provides a common language for describing the level of consciousness impairment.
And that experimental PCI measure we talked about, using magnetic pulses.
Right, that 2013 procedure measuring brain activity complexity offers a potentially more sophisticated, quantitative assessment of the presence and perhaps even level of consciousness, independent of the patient's ability to respond behaviorally.
So, studying all these disorders, what's sometimes called philosophical psychopathology, it really gives us crucial insights into normal consciousness, doesn't it? By seeing how it breaks.
Absolutely, it's like reverse engineering. For example, split brain patients, people whose corpus callosum connecting the two brain hemispheres was severed, usually to treat severe epilepsy, they raise profound questions.
About whether they have two separate centers of consciousness.
Exactly. The information presented to one hemisphere isn't available to the other, leading to some bizarre behaviors and questioning the unity of consciousness.
And blind sight.
Another classic example, damage to the primary visual cortex causes blindness in part of the visual field. Yet, remarkably, some blind sight patients can still guess, significantly better than chance, the location or orientation of objects presented in their blind field, while insisting they see nothing.
So they can see it in some functional sense, but without conscious visual awareness.
Right. It challenges the seemingly tight link between visual processing and conscious visual experience. Shows they can come apart.
And things like phantom limb pain, where amputees feel vivid sensations in the missing limb.
Yep. Or various agnosias, where people lose the ability to recognize objects, faces, or sounds despite intact senses.
Well,
Or autism, with its different patterns of social awareness and sensory processing. Or schizophrenia, with its profound alterations in thought and self-awareness.
and synesthesia, where senses get mixed up.
Right, people who might taste shapes or see colors associated with musical notes. All these conditions, these fascinating variations and breakdowns, offer unique windows into the incredibly complex mechanisms, the vulnerabilities, and the sheer diversity of conscious experience. They show us just how intricate and, frankly, how fragile our normal awareness truly is.
Wow. Okay. We have covered a lot of ground. We've taken a truly comprehensive deep dive into consciousness today.
We really have, journeying all the way from those ancient philosophical inquiries and shifting historical definitions,
Through the really intense mind-body problem debated by dualists and physicalists.
and diving into the vibrant scientific search for neural correlates and these fascinating cognitive models like GWT and IIT.
We've even peeked into the profound implications for animal awareness and, the future of artificial intelligence.
Not to mention how altered states and all those diverse medical conditions shed remarkable light on the very nature of consciousness by showing us how it works and how it can change.
So hopefully you listening now have a really multifaceted understanding of one of existence's greatest puzzles, complete with, I think, some surprising facts and critical insights that definitely go far beyond a simple headline.
Absolutely. It's a puzzle we're still actively working on from so many different angles.
Okay, so here's a final provocative thought to leave you with. If conscious experience, as some theories suggest, gives us this remarkable flexibility, the ability to adapt to novel situations, to plan, to distinguish appearance from reality, what profound implications does that hold for our ongoing quest to build truly conscious artificial intelligence?
And perhaps flipping that around,
Mhm.
how might that quest to build conscious AI, whether we succeed or fail, end up changing our own evolving understanding of reality and ourselves, especially in this increasingly complex and digitally intertwined world we're living in?